High in Colorado's Rocky Mountains, where the air is thin and the nights fall fast, a white hotel sits above Estes Park like it was placed there by mistake. Not because it's ugly, the opposite. It's almost too perfect, symmetrical, elegant, bright against dark pines and granite peaks. And that contrast is exactly why it unsettles people. The Stanley Hotel looks like a sanctuary, but it behaves like a question. Visitors come for fresh mountain air, weddings, sunsets, and that old-world idea of escaping the modern world. Then, usually after midnight, the mood shifts. A door that should be latched isn't. A hallway that should be quiet isn't. An elevator stops on a floor no one called. And the strangest part is this. Most stories aren't about terror. They're about presence, like the building is still hosting someone you can't see. The legend exploded because of one night in 1974 when a writer stayed in a nearly empty hotel and walked its silent corridors until the silence walked back. But the haunting reputation didn't begin with Stephen King. It began decades earlier, with a man who came here to survive and ended up building something that outlived him in the most unexpected way. Because the Stanley Hotel wasn't built to be haunted, it was built to heal. And that's what makes what happened next so disturbing. To understand why the Stanley feels awake, you have to go back to a time when one diagnosis could erase your future. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, tuberculosis wasn't just an illness, it was a slow, public fading. The coughing, the exhaustion, the blood. The way families watched people shrink in front of them, helpless to stop it. Doctors had no miracle cure, but they did have a belief. Altitude and dry air could help. That belief sent the sick west, toward mountains, pine forests, and towns that grew around hope. It created sanatoriums, lung resorts, and entire economies built on the idea that the right air could buy time. Freeland Oscar Stanley was exactly the kind of man who refused to accept an ending. Born in Maine in 1849, he was an inventor and a builder, the kind of person who didn't just work around problems, he engineered his way through them. Alongside his twin brother Francis, they created the Stanley Steamer, an early automobile that was quiet, fast, and shockingly advanced for its time. By the early 1900s, the Stanley brothers were successful, wealthy, respected. They should have been untouchable. Then, in 1903, F.O. Stanley received the diagnosis that made money feel meaningless: tuberculosis. Doctors told the truth as they understood it. Go west, change your air, and hope. At 54 years old, Stanley left behind his world and headed to Colorado, expecting to lose. Instead, the mountains gave him something he didn't expect. They gave him his life back. When Stanley arrived in Estes Park, it wasn't the tourist landmark it is today. It was rugged and remote, a mountain town framed by wild streams and steep slopes, where the weather could turn violent without warning. But the air was clean, cold, thin, and strangely, it helped. His recovery wasn't instant. This wasn't a movie miracle, but it was real enough to change his plans. Breathing became easier, strength returned, weeks became months, months became years. A man who had come to die began to think about living. And Stanley wasn't a type to quietly accept a second chance. He wanted to build something that proved the mountains weren't just beautiful, they were powerful. He imagined a hotel that would bring wealthy guests to the wilderness, people seeking health, calm, and status. A palace above the valley, a destination for an America that was racing toward modernity. But here's the twist. He wasn't building for the present. He was building for a future that didn't exist yet. Stanley believed the automobile would rewrite travel.
He believed people would drive into the Rockies as easily as they took trains to the coast. He believed Estes Park would become the kind of place rich families bragged about because they could breathe here in a way the cities could never offer. So he bought land on a hillside overlooking the town, 160 acres of mountain slope, and committed to an idea that many locals considered insane: building a luxury hotel in a place that still felt like the edge of the map. And Stanley did what he always did. He engineered the world to match his vision.
The Stanley Hotel opened in 1909, and even today, the design still carries a message: refinement, order, and confidence. Colonial revival, white clapboard siding, clean lines, tall windows, wide verandas. It didn't look like a frontier lodge. It looked like an East Coast estate that had been lifted and placed in the mountains. Inside, it was meant to feel like the future, one of the first hotels west of the Mississippi fully powered by electricity. That wasn't just convenient, it was a flex. To make it happen, Stanley built his own hydroelectric plant on the nearby river. He brought modern luxury to a landscape that still ran on horses, wagons, and grit. The opening was celebrated like a statement. America could build elegance anywhere. Guests arrived dressed in their best, stepping into polished wood floors and bright electric lights. Dining rooms, music rooms, billiard rooms, places where civilization performed itself. For a brief moment, Stanley's dream looked unstoppable. But the problem wasn't the hotel. The problem was the world outside it. In 1909, cars were still rare. Roads were still punishing. The trip from Denver, only about 60 miles, could take an entire day. Vehicles broke down. People arrived exhausted and covered in dust. And then there was winter. Rocky Mountain winters didn't care about Stanley's vision. Roads disappeared under snow. Temperatures dropped. The hotel couldn't survive year-round. It had to close for months. And that's where the Stanley Hotel's personality began to form, not as a bustling resort, but as a grand building that spent long stretches empty, quiet enough to hear itself breathe. Empty buildings do something to human brains. We expect noise, movement, other people, and when we don't get them, our minds fill the gap. But at the Stanley, the emptiness wasn't a temporary inconvenience, it became a routine. Season after season, the hotel would shine in summer and then slip into silence for winter. Operating costs were brutal: heating, staffing, maintenance, running an independent power system. Stanley poured money into the hotel for years, waiting for the automobile age to catch up and turn his mountain palace into a constant destination. But while the business struggled, the stories began. Caretakers staying through the off-season reported footsteps in empty hallways, doors locked at night found open in the morning. And the most unsettling detail, some claim they heard music drifting from the music room, soft piano melodies, like someone rehearsing in the dark. When they checked, the room was empty. At first, it sounded like classic isolation: long winter nights, wind outside, old wood settling, imagination doing what it does. But the reports didn't fade. They repeated. People who hadn't talked to each other described the same places, the same sounds, the same feeling. The Stanley was becoming known as a place that didn't fully shut down when the guests left. And then, in 1911, something happened that turned rumor into a permanent anchor point in the hotel's mythology. An accident that created the most famous room in the building, Room 217. The story of Room 217 doesn't start with a murder. It starts with a storm. In 1911, lightning hammered the mountains and struck the hotel, triggering a gas leak. A housekeeper named Elizabeth Wilson was in Room 217, lighting the lamps, routine work in an era when routine still involved open flame. The room exploded. The blast was violent enough to throw her through the floor into the room below.
It sounds like the kind of accident that would become a legend automatically. But here's what makes it strange. Elizabeth survived. She recovered. She returned to work. She lived a long life. So why did her name become the centerpiece of the Stanley's haunting reputation? Because guests began reporting something that felt oddly personal, like the room was still being managed. Luggage unpacked while they were out, clothes moved, items rearranged, lights flickering. It wasn't a monster in the closet haunting. It was housekeeping. Some guests described waking to a presence at the foot of the bed, not attacking, not screaming, just watching, as if checking the room. When the lights snapped on, there was nothing there. And because the story didn't involve violence, it became easier to believe. It sounded like a leftover habit, a routine that refused to end. Over time, room 217 became the most requested room in the hotel. People didn't avoid it, they hunted it. And that's another twist in this story. The Stanley didn't become famous because it scared people away. It became famous because it scared them in a way they could visit. But room 217 was only the beginning.
If room 217 is the Stanley's headline, the rest of the building is the chorus. Guests report movement at the edge of vision, shadows slipping behind doorways, reflections that don't match what's behind you. Some claim doors open on their own, especially late at night when the hotel quiets down and small noises feel louder than they should. Then there's the music room. During the early years, Flora Stanley, F.O.'s wife, performed there. She was a pianist, and the hotel's social identity depended on that kind of elegance. Concerts, gatherings, the image of culture perched above the valley. After Flora died in 1939, employees began reporting piano music at night, clear, controlled melodies, not random banging. They'd walk into the room expecting to find someone practicing. The music would stop. The room would be empty. And the emotion people describe isn't fear, it's sadness, like hearing a memory on repeat. F.O. Stanley himself is also said to appear. A well-dressed man in the lobby, on the staircase, in the billiard room. A presence that feels less like a haunting and more like ownership, like a builder checking the work, making sure his creation hasn't been forgotten. But the Stanley's most intense stories don't come from the lobby. They come from higher up, the fourth floor. And the reports there share one detail so consistent it's almost unsettling. Laughter. The fourth floor feels different to people who work at the Stanley. Guests sometimes describe it with the same phrases, even when they don't know its reputation. Heavy, charged, wrong. And the stories repeat. The sound of children running, quick footsteps, giggles in hallways that should be empty. Some guests claim they've seen handprints on mirrors. Others describe their blankets tugged at night, not violently, more like teasing. There are multiple explanations people offer. Some say the fourth floor holds residual energy, an imprint like a recording from when wealthy families brought their children here for summers. Others believe the hotel's long winters, its isolation, and the emotional weight of sick guests created something like a magnet, a place where echoes collect. What's notable is when the activity feels strongest, off-season, winter, when the hotel is quieter, when staff numbers shrink, when long corridors turn into tunnels of silence. That's when employees report footsteps overhead with no one there, furniture moved slightly, doors found open, items placed in odd locations. And whether or not you believe in ghosts, there's a psychological truth here. Solitude changes perception. It amplifies everything. An old building in a storm becomes a living thing. Pipes become whispers. Floor creaks become pacing. But the Stanley has something solitude alone can't manufacture. A storyline, a chain of history,
ambition, decline, and reinvention that gives every strange noise a place to land. And in the 1970s, the Stanley was on the edge of becoming something else entirely. Not a resort, not a healing retreat, a relic, a beautiful one, but a fading one. Until one night in 1974, when a writer arrived at the worst possible time for comfort and the best possible time for inspiration. By the 1970s, the Stanley Hotel was aging. Its glory era had passed. Estes Park had grown, but travelers had options: smaller lodges, cheaper stays, newer comforts. The Stanley still opened in summer and closed in winter, limping forward season after season, surviving more on stubbornness than profit. In late September 1974, Stephen King and his wife Tabitha arrived, by accident more than intention. They were on a trip through Colorado and decided to stop. But the timing was perfect in the most unsettling way. The hotel was closing for the season. Most of the staff had already left. The dining room had one table set. The hallways stretched long and empty. That night, King and his wife were among the last guests. Some accounts say they were the only ones. Either way, the building was close to silent. And silence in a hotel feels unnatural. Hotels are built for life. Doors opening, voices traveling, footfalls in corridors. When that disappears, the architecture doesn't change, but your relationship to it does. The same hallway becomes longer, the same shadows become deeper. King wandered the building after dinner. He walked the corridors, he climbed the stairs, he stood in rooms that looked like they were waiting for an audience. And in room 217 that night, he had a nightmare. His young son running through hallways, chased by something unseen, a hotel that wasn't merely haunted, but hungry. By morning, King had the outline of a novel: a winter caretaker, a snowbound hotel, isolation that becomes a weapon. He called it The Shining. The Stanley didn't just inspire horror fiction, it became linked to it. And after the book and the film took off, the hotel gained something it never had before: a profitable identity. But here's what most retellings miss. The Stanley's haunting reputation existed before King. King didn't create the darkness, he gave it a name. When The Shining was published in 1977, it became a hit. When Stanley Kubrick's film arrived in 1980, it became a cultural myth. And even though Kubrick didn't film at the Stanley, the public didn't care. People wanted the real Overlook. The Stanley became a destination for fear. Room 217 became a pilgrimage site. Ghost tours formed. Paranormal investigators arrived with cameras, audio recorders, EMF meters, tools designed to catch the invisible. And in the modern era, this created a loop. People arrive expecting something. That expectation heightens attention. Heightened attention turns normal oddities into events. Those events become stories. The stories grow. Skeptics say the loop explains everything. Old buildings creak, drafts create cold spots, infrasound can trigger unease, lighting creates shadows, suggestion fills in the rest. And honestly, some of that is true. The human brain is a pattern-making machine. If we believe a place is haunted, we will interpret the world through that filter. But skepticism also has a weakness. It can explain a single story. It struggles with consistent patterns across decades, especially among staff who weren't tourists hunting thrills. Employees working night shifts and winter off-seasons report the same hot zones, the same elevator stops, the same fourth-floor disturbances, the same music room reports. And that consistency is what keeps the Stanley in the cultural spotlight. Because even if you don't believe in ghosts, it's hard to ignore a place where the stories don't scatter randomly, they cluster. So let's talk about the phenomenon that might be the Stanley's strangest signature: the elevator behavior. The Stanley's elevators are old-fashioned. the kind that feel like they belong to another era. They're also one of the most frequently cited active elements in the hotel. Staff and guests report elevators moving floor to floor with no one inside, doors opening as if someone has arrived, waiting, then closing again. Skeptics point to mechanical quirks. Old systems can behave unpredictably. But here's the problem. The reports often describe a pattern. The elevator stops most frequently on floors associated with the Stanleys and the hotel's most active zones. And in paranormal investigations, elevators are considered a classic interaction point because they're visible and structured. Either the elevator moves or it doesn't. Either doors open or they don't. It's not like hearing a noise that could be anything. Some investigation teams claim they've recorded the elevator sequence overnight, doors opening on a floor, pausing as if someone is getting in, then moving to another floor, pausing again and returning. Even if you assume every haunting claim is exaggerated, the Stanley stories highlight something real. The Stanley feels like it has routines. A hotel is an organism built on routines, cleaning schedules, guest arrivals, music performances, evening quiet, staff rounds. When a hotel is empty, those routines vanish, but the building remains. And that's where the Stanley's core mystery lives. Is it haunted by spirits or haunted by habits? Because what people describe isn't always fear, it's repetition. Like the building is replaying a century of hospitality, even when no one is supposed to be there. That brings us to the biggest question. If the Stanley isn't defined by tragedy, no massive massacre, no single horror event, why does it feel haunted at all? The answer might be less supernatural than people want, and more human than they expect.
The Stanley Hotel isn't famous for one violent story. It's famous for something subtler: loneliness. Think about who came here in the early days. People sick enough to travel for air, wealthy guests escaping cities, families sending children away for summers, staff working long off-season shifts in a near-empty building. A hotel is not a home. It's a transition space. People pass through it. And transition spaces collect emotion in a unique way: hope, nervousness, anticipation, fear, relief. You arrive different than you leave. Now multiply that by more than a century. Thousands of arrivals, thousands of farewells, sickness, healing, failures, second chances, the weight of seasons, empty winters. If hauntings are echoes, the Stanley is built to produce echoes. Its long corridors, high ceilings, and vast quiet rooms amplify sound and amplify feeling. And because it was designed as a luxurious refuge, it carries an emotional contradiction: comfort on the surface, isolation underneath. That contradiction is powerful. It explains why the Stanley feels between worlds. It's not just the mountain fog or the moonlit windows. It's the sense that this place was meant to be full, but often wasn't. And when people describe the Stanley's haunting vibe, they rarely say evil. They say watching. They say aware. They say not alone. Which brings us back to room 217. If Elizabeth Wilson's presence is real, or if the story simply captures the spirit of the hotel, why is it so focused on order? Unpacking bags, straightening rooms, moving items like someone still believes guests are coming. Because maybe the Stanley is haunted by something even scarier than death: purpose that refuses to end. And then there's the most controversial part of modern Stanley lore: celebrity stories and unexplained incidents that keep the myth alive. Some Stanley stories live in whispers because they can't be proven, and that uncertainty makes them stronger. One example often repeated is the claim that an actor stayed at the Stanley and fled in the night, refusing to describe what happened. Whether or not every detail is true, stories like this serve a function.
They keep the hotel's reputation active. But the real fuel isn't celebrity, it's workers. People who stay after the tours end, after the guests sleep, after the cameras leave. Night auditors, maintenance staff, housekeeping teams. These are the people who encounter the Stanley when it's not performing for tourists. And many of them describe the same thing. The hotel feels different after midnight. Not a jump scare, not a monster. A shift. A hallway that feels too long. A silence that feels too intentional. A moment where your brain is listening harder than it should. Skeptics would say that's exactly how anxiety works. You're alone, it's dark, it's an old building, your mind fills gaps. But then come the details that keep the debate alive. Objects moved in ways that don't fit simple drafts. Doors that open after being locked. Footsteps on floors that are empty. A piano note that stops the instant someone enters. And if even a fraction of those reports are accurate, the Stanley becomes a place where the unknown isn't violent, it's persistent. Like a presence that has learned the building and knows how to touch reality lightly enough to avoid detection, but strongly enough to be remembered. Which leads to the modern era, where paranormal investigation becomes entertainment. Shows arrive, the hotel becomes a set, and the myth expands. But the greatest twist in the Stanley story is that its haunted reputation may have saved it financially. The darkness didn't destroy the hotel. It rescued it. And once a place becomes famous for being haunted, a new question appears. Are people experiencing ghosts, or are they experiencing the power of story?
The Stanley Hotel is proof that storytelling can change reality. Before The Shining, the hotel struggled. After The Shining, the hotel had a brand. People came to chase the feeling King described. That's not just tourism, that's mythology. When enough people repeat a story, it becomes the lens through which everything is interpreted. A creak becomes a footstep, a draft becomes a cold presence, an elevator pause becomes a signal. But here's the deeper point. Even if the paranormal isn't real, the experience can still be real. Fear is real. Unease is real. The sense of being watched is real. The Stanley's architecture amplifies this. Long corridors with repeating doors create the illusion of endlessness. Large empty rooms create the sense that sound should exist but doesn't. High windows and moonlight create shadow play. And the location itself does the rest. At 7,500 feet, oxygen is lower. People sleep differently. Dreams intensify. Nighttime anxiety increases. The mind becomes more suggestible. Add all of that together, and you get a perfect storm. A beautiful building, a remote landscape, a famous horror story, and a steady stream of visitors primed to interpret ambiguity as evidence. But again, the skeptics have a problem. They can explain why people believe. They can explain why visitors feel uneasy. They can explain why stories spread. What they can't easily explain is why the Stanley's phenomena, if we assume even a portion is true, clusters in certain places with such consistency. Room 217, the music room, the fourth floor, the elevators. That clustering is why investigators argue the Stanley displays something called an intelligent haunting, a presence that reacts rather than replays. We won't claim certainty, that's not the point. The point is that the Stanley doesn't offer answers, it offers patterns. And patterns are what humans can't resist. So why do some rooms feel alive while others feel normal? One theory, whether you take it literally or psychologically, is that places accumulate meaning. Not just history, but emotional charge. Room 217 carries the story of explosion and survival. The music room carries years of performances and social elegance. The fourth floor carries youth, laughter, and long summer memories. The lobby carries arrival energy, people stepping into a new world. In other words, the Stanley's haunted identity is built on experiences that had intensity, even if they weren't tragic. And this is where the Stanley differs from typical haunted house legends. Many famous hauntings are tied to violence, suffering, and unfinished business. The Stanley's most famous presences are tied to routine and belonging. A housekeeper continuing her work, a pianist continuing her music, a builder continuing to check his dream. That's why people describe the hotel as not evil. It's unsettling, but not hostile. It's like walking into a building that still thinks it's 1909. Then there's the fourth floor, which complicates everything because childlike laughter is the creepiest possible sound in the wrong context. It isn't threatening, it's just wrong in an empty hallway at 2 a.m. And the more you study the Stanley, the more the haunting begins to look like a metaphor for what the hotel actually is, a time capsule. A place built for a future, stranded in an era, revived by a story, and now permanently suspended between reality and fiction. Which brings us to the moment the Stanley fully embraced its legend. Ghost tours, paranormal events, films, documentaries, investigators. The hotel didn't fight the myth, it welcomed it like a guest. Once the Stanley accepted its haunted reputation, it became two things at once: a historic luxury hotel and a living set for paranormal imagination. The tours became nightly rituals, stories became standardized, room numbers became symbols. And that's where the Stanley's legend reaches its strangest form. The hotel is now haunted not only by what might be inside it, but by what people carry into it. Visitors arrive with The Shining already in their minds. Some arrive hoping to feel something, some arrive hoping to prove something, and some arrive with skepticism so strong they want the hotel to fail. But the building doesn't care. It does what it does. It holds sound strangely. It stretches silence. It creates long moments where your brain expects a movement that never comes. And in those moments, people project meaning. That projection isn't fake. It's human. And it's why haunted places never die. They provide an experience that feels personal because your own mind is part of it. Now add the fact that the Stanley is stunning. Mountains behind it, storm clouds above it, fog rolling across the valley, a bright white facade glowing at night. It looks like a stage for a story. So when someone hears a piano note or sees a shadow, it doesn't feel random. It feels scripted, like the hotel knows its role. Which leads to the most unsettling idea of all. What if the Stanley doesn't need ghosts to feel haunted? What if it was designed, accidentally, to produce the sensation? Because even without belief, the Stanley has something rare, atmosphere so strong it becomes evidence. Let's zoom out. If you strip away the ghost stories, what remains is still powerful. A man survives a deadly disease, falls in love with a mountain town, and builds a grand hotel in the wilderness, too early for the world to support it. He creates electricity in a place that barely has roads. He builds beauty where people expect roughness. And then he watches the hotel fight to survive for decades. F.O. Stanley died in 1940. Flora died in 1939. Ownership changed hands, the building aged, the world moved forward. And yet the hotel remained. And here's where the Stanley's identity becomes almost poetic. The hotel's survival came not from convenience or modern upgrades, but from the very thing that once made it feel like a failure: isolation. That isolation became its mystique. Its silence became its signature. Its long winters became its mythology factory. Then Stephen King arrives and pours gasoline on the legend, and suddenly the Stanley becomes a symbol, not merely of a place, but of a fear, being trapped somewhere beautiful that doesn't let you rest. That fear is timeless. It speaks to something universal.
The idea that loneliness can become a presence, that an empty building can feel aware, that memory can cling to walls. That's why the Stanley doesn't fade. It's not just haunted, it's meaningful. It holds themes people can't resist: healing versus decay, luxury versus isolation, hope versus unease. And the final question is the one people keep asking, quietly, late at night, in their own minds. If a building can hold a story so strongly, what else can? If you've ever walked through a quiet hallway and felt watched, you know the Stanley's power. It's not proof, it's not certainty. It's that subtle shift when your body reacts before your mind explains. Maybe that's all a haunting is, a body remembering what it doesn't understand. Science offers explanations: suggestion, expectation, sleep disruption, altitude effects, infrasound, electromagnetic anomalies, and those explanations matter. They remind us not to treat fear as truth. But the Stanley reminds us of something else, too. Stories are not harmless. They shape perception. They change behavior. They build myths that feel more solid than facts. And the Stanley has one of the most powerful myths a building can have. It inspired a horror story that became a cultural landmark. That myth feeds itself because every visitor becomes part of it. You're not just staying in a hotel. You're stepping into a narrative. That narrative follows you into sleep. It colors every sound. It frames every shadow. And if something strange happens, something you can't immediately explain, it becomes unforgettable. That's why the Stanley is one of the rare haunted places where the debate never ends. Both sides can argue forever. Skeptics can say the mind creates it. Believers can say the hotel responds. And the hotel stands there, bright against dark mountains, indifferent to the argument, collecting stories like snowfall. In the end, maybe the Stanley's greatest haunting isn't a ghost. It's the feeling it leaves behind, the sense that some places remember.
Today, the Stanley Hotel is thriving. Weddings, tours, conferences, guests from around the world. It's listed on historic registers, celebrated as a cultural landmark, photographed constantly. And yet, even now, when the rooms are full and the hallways are lit, people still describe the same moments. A corridor that feels too long, a silence that drops suddenly, a sound that stops the instant you turn toward it. Room 217 remains the most requested room. Guests report everything from playful disturbances to unsettling impressions. The fourth floor remains the floor staff avoid alone. The music room still carries that famous after-hours aura. And the strangest part is how many visitors leave not with fear, but with a kind of reverence, like they touched something ancient, not necessarily supernatural, but emotionally heavy. Because the Stanley is a monument to human hope. A man tried to outrun disease with a dream. He built a palace in the wilderness. He believed the future would arrive on wheels and fill his hotel with life. He was partly right. People did come. The hotel did survive. But it survived in a way he could never have predicted. Not as a medical refuge, not as a luxurious escape, but as a place people travel to feel a shiver they can't explain. And once a place becomes that, it doesn't matter whether ghosts are real. The effect is real. The Stanley endures because it gives people what they secretly crave: a beautiful location, a powerful myth, and a question that follows them into the dark. On quiet nights, when conversations fade and the hotel slips into its after-hours calm, the Stanley returns to its oldest form, a grand building perched above the valley, watching the mountains breathe. The lobby lights glow, the hallways stretch into silence. Somewhere, a door settles. Somewhere, wood creaks like a footstep. Somewhere, the elevator pauses as if waiting for a passenger who never arrives. Maybe it's mechanical. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's your mind. Or maybe the hotel is doing what it has always done, hosting, holding space, keeping order, preserving the routines of another century like a song that never fully ends. Because the Stanley was never just a building, it was an idea that isolation could heal, that beauty could save, that the future would arrive and make the mountains accessible to anyone with money and time. And in a strange, sideways way, it worked. People do arrive, they do gather, they do remember. But the Stanley also asks a final question, one that lingers longer than any ghost story. What does a place become when enough human life passes through it? What remains when the voices leave? And why do certain buildings feel like they're still listening? Maybe the Stanley's haunting isn't a spirit. Maybe it's memory. And if that's true, then the hotel doesn't need to scare you. It only needs to do one thing: make you feel for a moment that the past is still here and that it knows you're walking through it.